When Daniel bought his house in Willowbrook Estates 5 years ago, he genuinely believed he'd found the perfect place to settle down. The neighborhood looked like something straight out of a magazine. Every lawn was perfectly trimmed, the streets were clean, and the houses all had this warm, welcoming look to them. There was even a nice little park in the middle of the community where kids played and neighbors chatted on weekend mornings. The gated entrance made him feel secure, and the HOA seemed like a reasonable trade-off for living in such a well-maintained area. Sure, there were rules about what color you could paint your house and how tall your grass could be, but Daniel figured those rules kept everyone's property values high. Besides, he wasn't the type to cause trouble or break rules anyway. What made the deal even sweeter was that he'd inherited the property from his Uncle Richard, who'd passed away the year before. Uncle Richard had been one of those quiet, clever men who never made a big fuss about anything, but always seemed to know exactly what he was doing. He'd lived in that house since the neighborhood was built back in the 80s, watching Willowbrook grow from empty farmland into a thriving community of over 100 families. Daniel remembered visiting his uncle as a kid, running around what used to be open fields before the developers came in. Uncle Richard used to tell stories about how he'd negotiated with those developers, but Daniel had been too young to pay much attention to the boring adult talk about property and contracts. Now he wished he'd listened more carefully. The house came with boxes and boxes of old paperwork that Daniel had shoved into his attic, meaning to sort through them someday. Tax documents, old receipts, legal papers with fancy language he didn't understand. It all seemed like ancient history that had nothing to do with his life now. He was just grateful to have inherited a beautiful home in a great neighborhood without a mortgage hanging over his head. For the first few years, life in Willowbrook was everything he'd hoped for. His neighbors were friendly enough, waving when they saw him and making small talk about the weather or local sports teams. The HOA board seemed reasonable, sending out monthly newsletters about community events and reminding people to trim their hedges or bring in their trash cans on time. Daniel paid his HOA fees without complaint and followed the rules without thinking much about them. He'd started his own construction business a few years back, and it was finally taking off. He had a work truck that he parked in his driveway and a small trailer for hauling equipment. Nobody had ever said anything about it. Plenty of other neighbors had boats or RVs parked at their houses, so Daniel figured his work vehicles were no big deal. Then everything changed when the HOA held elections for a new board. A woman named Mrs. Whitmore won the position of board president. She'd lived in Willowbrook for about 3 years and had made quite a name for herself by constantly complaining at community meetings about various violations she'd spotted around the neighborhood. A Christmas wreath still hanging up in January, a basketball hoop positioned 6 inches too close to the street, lawn furniture that didn't match the approved color scheme. Most people had rolled their eyes at her nitpicking, but apparently enough homeowners voted for her because they thought she'd protect their property values. Or maybe they were just tired and didn't bother voting at all. Either way, Mrs. Whitmore became the new president, and she wasted no time making her presence felt. Within her first month, she'd sent out a revised copy of the HOA rules. The document was 30 pages longer than the old one, and filled with regulations Daniel had never heard of. Mailboxes had to be a specific shade of black. Garden decorations couldn't exceed certain dimensions. Security cameras had to be positioned in particular ways. The list went on and on. Daniel skimmed through it but didn't worry too much. He kept his property neat, didn't cause problems, and figured he'd be fine. That assumption lasted exactly 2 more weeks. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel found it tucked into his door, a bright yellow paper that immediately caught his eye. His stomach sank as he read it. Apparently, his work truck violated a newly updated rule about commercial vehicles being parked in residential driveways overnight. The fine was $500, and he had 72 hours to remove the truck or face additional daily penalties. Daniel stared at the notice in disbelief. His truck had been parked in that same spot for 3 years. It wasn't some massive semi-truck or anything obnoxious, just a regular pickup with his company name on the side. He needed it for work, and his driveway was his property. How could they suddenly decide it was a problem? He called the HOA office the next morning, hoping to clear up what he assumed must be a misunderstanding. The woman who answered the phone was polite but firm. The rule was in the updated bylaws, she explained, and all residents had been notified. If he had concerns, he could attend the next board meeting and present his case. The meeting was 2 weeks away, but the 72-hour deadline on his fine was not. Daniel asked what he was supposed to do with his truck in the meantime. Park it on the street? That was against county regulations for commercial vehicles. Rent a storage unit? That would cost him hundreds of dollars a month. The woman on the phone said she sympathized, but rules were rules. Daniel felt the first real stirring of anger. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. This was about control and power. But he tried to keep his cool. He was a reasonable person, and he believed in working through proper channels. He'd go to the meeting, explain his situation, and surely the board would see reason. He temporarily parked his truck at a friend's business lot and counted down the days until the HOA meeting. When the night finally arrived, he showed up early with notes he'd prepared. The community center meeting room was only about half full, mostly the usual faces who attended every meeting, plus a few others who, like him, probably had grievances to air. Mrs. Whitmore ran the meeting with the precision of a drill sergeant. She moved through the agenda items quickly, barely allowing time for questions. When they finally reached the open forum section where residents could speak, Daniel raised his hand and was called on. He stood up and calmly explained his situation. His truck was essential for his business. It wasn't an eyesore or a safety hazard. He'd been parking it in his driveway for years without any complaints. He respectfully requested that the board either make an exception or give him time to find a reasonable solution. Mrs. Whitmore listened with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. When Daniel finished, she thanked him for his input and immediately launched into a speech about the importance of maintaining community standards. Rules existed for everyone's benefit, she said. If they made exceptions for one person, they'd have to make exceptions for everyone, and then chaos would reign. The neighborhood's property values depended on strict enforcement. Another board member tried to suggest a compromise, maybe allowing the truck if it was parked in the garage, but Mrs. Whitmore cut him off. She called for a vote on Daniel's request. 4 board members voted to deny his appeal. Only 1 voted in his favor. Just like that, it was over. Daniel's $500 fine stood, and if he didn't comply, additional penalties would be added daily. He left the meeting feeling frustrated and helpless. Something about the way Mrs. Whitmore had looked at him during his speech made him uneasy. It was like she'd taken his request as a personal challenge. He had no idea how right he was or how much worse things were about to get. Daniel thought the truck incident would be the end of his troubles with the HOA. He found a storage facility about 15 minutes away and started parking his truck there overnight, even though it meant leaving his house earlier every morning to pick it up before work. The monthly fee stung, but he paid it and tried to move on. He'd learned his lesson about challenging Mrs. Whitmore, but apparently Mrs. Whitmore hadn't learned anything about leaving him alone. The second violation notice arrived 3 weeks later. This time it was about his fence. The same fence that had been there when he inherited the house from his uncle. The same fence that had been standing for over 20 years without anyone complaining about it. According to the notice, the fence exceeded the maximum allowable height by 2 inches. 2 inches. The fine was another $500. Daniel measured the fence himself 3 times, certain there had to be a mistake. The fence was exactly 6 feet tall, which he thought was standard. He dug out his old HOA documents and found that the previous rule had allowed 6-foot fences. But sure enough, in Mrs. Whitmore's updated bylaws, the maximum fence height was now 5 feet 10 inches. He looked around the neighborhood during his evening walk. At least a dozen other homes had 6-foot fences, probably more. Were they all getting violation notices too? He asked a few neighbors and they looked at him with confusion. No, they hadn't received any notices about their fences. Daniel felt a cold realization settling in. He was being targeted. He tried to fight this one too. He submitted a written appeal pointing out that other identical fences existed throughout the neighborhood, without violation notices. He noted that his fence had been there for decades, long before the new rule was created. Surely there should be some grandfather clause for existing structures. The board denied his appeal without even inviting him to another meeting. The letter was brief and formal. All structures must comply with current regulations regardless of when they were built. Residents had 90 days to bring non-compliant structures into compliance. His fence had to be modified or removed. Modifying the fence would cost him at least $2,000. Daniel was a contractor, so he could do the work himself. But he'd still need to buy materials and spend his limited free time fixing a fence that wasn't actually broken. The whole thing was absurd. He paid the fine, put the fence modification on his to-do list, and hoped that would be the end of it. That hope lasted exactly 1 month. The third violation came for his new storage shed. He'd built it himself, a neat little 8x10 structure in his backyard where he kept his lawnmower and gardening tools. He'd specifically checked the HOA rules before building it and made sure it met all the requirements for size, placement, and appearance. He'd even painted it the same color as his house. But according to Mrs. Whitmore, he'd failed to submit architectural plans for approval before construction. There was a rule buried in the bylaws that any new structure, even a small shed, required board approval first. The fine was $1,000, and he was ordered to either submit the shed for retroactive approval or remove it entirely. Daniel couldn't believe it. He'd lived in this neighborhood for 5 years and never heard of anyone submitting plans to build a basic storage shed. He asked more neighbors, and most of them had sheds in their yards. One guy had built a massive workshop that was practically a second garage. None of them had submitted architectural plans to the HOA. When Daniel asked that neighbor if he'd gotten approval, the man laughed. "You're supposed to, but nobody really does that for small stuff." The old board didn't care as long as things looked nice. The old board, before Mrs. Whitmore. Daniel submitted his architectural plans for retroactive approval, complete with photos and measurements, proving the shed met all size and appearance requirements. The board took 6 weeks to review them before sending a denial letter. The shed's roof pitch was apparently 1 degree off from the approved architectural guidelines. 1 degree that you couldn't even notice unless you measured it precisely with special equipment. The denial letter also informed him that because he'd now officially submitted plans that were rejected, his fine had increased to $2,000, and he'd be charged an additional $500 per week until the shed was removed. Daniel stood in his backyard, staring at his perfectly nice shed that matched his house and hurt nobody, and felt something break inside him. This wasn't about rules or property values or community standards. This was personal harassment disguised as HOA enforcement. Mrs. Whitmore had decided to make his life miserable, and she had the power of the board behind her to do it. He started documenting everything. He took photos of other people's fences, sheds, and commercial vehicles. He kept copies of every notice he received and every communication with the HOA. He tracked which neighbors had similar violations that were never cited. The pattern was undeniable. Other people broke the same rules without consequences. Only Daniel kept getting targeted. The violations continued. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black, even though he'd never painted it, and it was the same mailbox his uncle had installed decades ago. Fine, $300. He trimmed his grass on a Tuesday, and the HOA claimed lawn care was only allowed on Wednesdays through Saturdays. Fine, $250. He left his trash can visible from the street on a non-pickup day, even though he'd brought it in the same evening. Fine, $400. Each violation came with a formal letter, often with photos attached that Mrs. Whitmore or someone on her behalf had clearly taken while walking past his house. Daniel began to feel watched. He was careful about everything now, checking and double-checking that he followed every tiny rule, but the notices kept coming. There was always something. He hung Christmas lights in early December, making sure they were white lights only, as specified in the holiday decoration guidelines. Someone filed a complaint that they were too bright. The board agreed. Fine, $600, and he had to take them down immediately, weeks before Christmas. A work trailer sat in his driveway for 45 minutes while he loaded equipment for a job. Someone reported it. The rule said commercial equipment couldn't be visible from the street for more than 30 minutes. Fine, $800. Daniel stopped having friends over because he was afraid their cars would be parked wrong, or they'd inadvertently violate some obscure rule that would cost him more money. His home, the place that was supposed to be a sanctuary, had become a source of constant stress. 6 months after that first truck violation, Daniel received a thick envelope via certified mail. His hands shook as he signed for it. Inside was a formal demand letter from the HOA's legal team. The total amount owed for violations, late fees, interest, and administrative charges was $70,000. $70,000. The letter gave him 30 days to pay in full or enter into a payment plan with a minimum monthly payment of $3,000. If he failed to comply, The HOA would begin foreclosure proceedings to place a lien on his property. They could force the sale of his house to recover the money. Daniel read the letter 3 times, certain he must be misunderstanding something. But the numbers were all there, itemized in painful detail. Each small fine had accumulated interest at 18% annually. Administrative fees of $100 had been added to each violation. Late payment penalties kicked in after 15 days. The math was technically correct, but the total was devastating. Attached to the legal demand was a personal note on Mrs. Whitmore's personal stationery. The message was brief and cold. Perhaps Willowbrook Estates isn't the right fit for everyone. Some people simply can't meet our community standards. Daniel sat at his kitchen table with that letter in his hands and felt more helpless than he'd ever felt in his life. He'd served his country in the military, built a successful business from nothing, and always played by the rules. Now some petty tyrant with a title and a grudge was trying to take his home away from him. He couldn't afford $70,000. Even if he could, paying it would be admitting defeat, validating this insane abuse of power. But if he didn't pay, he'd lose his uncle's house. He'd lose everything. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his uncle, wondering what Uncle Richard would do in this situation. His uncle had been a quiet man, but he'd been smart, strategic. He'd negotiated with those developers back in the 80s and somehow managed to live peacefully in this neighborhood for decades. Around 3 in the morning, exhausted and desperate, Daniel remembered those boxes in his attic. All those old papers and documents he'd never bothered to sort through. Maybe there was something in there that could help him. Old HOA rules that contradicted the new ones. Records of his uncle paying for improvements that proved the fence and shed were legitimate. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. As the sun started to rise, Daniel climbed the stairs to his attic and began searching through his uncle's papers. He had no idea that he was about to discover something that would change everything. The attic was hot and dusty, lit by a single bare bulb that Daniel had to pull a string to turn on. Cardboard boxes were stacked along the walls, some labeled in his uncle's neat handwriting, others marked only with years. Daniel had been meaning to go through all this stuff for years, but life always got in the way. Now he was desperate enough to face the tedious task of sorting through decades of paperwork. He started with boxes labeled house and property, figuring those were most likely to contain useful information. The first few boxes were disappointing. Old utility bills from the 90s, receipts for a new roof installed in 2003, warranties for appliances that had long since been replaced. Nothing that would help him fight the HOA. 3 hours in, covered in dust and fighting off sneezes, Daniel was ready to give up. Then he opened a banker's box that had been shoved into the far corner of the attic. The label was faded but readable. Development 1984. Inside were documents that made Daniel sit down right there on the attic floor and start reading carefully. There were letters between his uncle and a development company called Prestige Properties, site plans and surveys, and then at the bottom of the box, a legal document with an official seal and multiple signatures, easement agreement and right-of-way. The title read. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he read through the dense legal language. From what he could understand, his Uncle Richard had owned all 50 acres of the land that became Willowbrook Estates. When Prestige Properties wanted to develop it into a residential community, they'd negotiated a sale. But his uncle had been clever. He hadn't sold everything. According to the document, Uncle Richard had sold the residential lots, but specifically retained ownership of the main road running through the property. Willowbrook Way, the single street that connected all 127 homes to the main highway. The only way in or out of the entire neighborhood. The easement granted residents the right to use the road for access to their homes, but ownership remained with Uncle Richard and his heirs. The development company agreed to pay $1 per year in perpetual lease fees, and they agreed that the road would never be deeded to any homeowners association or municipality without the owner's explicit consent. Daniel read the document 3 times, his heart pounding harder each time. This couldn't be real, could it? He owned the road, the only road into and out of Willowbrook Estates. There was more. A clause near the end caught his attention. It stated that if any entity attempted to place a lien or forced sale on the owner's property within Willowbrook Estates, the easement agreement would be considered void. The owner would have the right to restrict or revoke access to the road entirely. Daniel sat in that hot attic with sweat running down his face and dust coating his clothes, and he started to laugh. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief and relief and a dozen other emotions all hitting at once. Mrs. Whitmore and her precious HOA board had just threatened to foreclose on his property. They'd threatened the very thing that would legally allow him to shut down their road, but he had to be sure. Legal documents from 1984 were one thing, but he needed to know if this easement was still valid. Property laws were complicated, and maybe something had changed over the decades. Maybe the easement had expired or been superseded by some other agreement he didn't know. Well, he climbed down from the attic with the entire box of documents and immediately called a real estate attorney his friend had recommended once. It was Saturday morning, so he left a voicemail explaining that he had an urgent property matter and needed a consultation as soon as possible. The attorney, Robert Chen, called him back Monday morning. They set up an appointment for that same afternoon. Daniel brought the entire box of documents and laid out his situation, from the harassment by the HOA to the $70,000 demand to his discovery of the easement agreement. Robert put on reading glasses and went through the documents carefully. He asked Daniel questions about the property, about when his uncle died, about the inheritance process. He pulled up county records on his computer and spent 20 minutes clicking through various databases. Finally, he sat back in his chair and smiled. This is valid. Completely valid. The road was never transferred to the county, never deeded to the HOA. According to the property records, Willowbrook Way is legally owned by you as the inheritor of your uncle's estate. The easement agreement is still in force. Daniel felt his throat go tight. So I actually own the only road into the neighborhood. You do. And more importantly, this clause here about voiding the easement if someone tries to force a sale of your property, that's enforceable. The HOA just handed you tremendous leverage by threatening foreclosure. They spent the next hour discussing Daniel's options. Robert was clear about the possibilities. Daniel could revoke access to the road entirely, though that would be extreme and would definitely result in lawsuits. He could negotiate new terms for the easement, potentially charging fees or setting conditions. Or he could use this information as leverage to make the harassment stop and get his bogus fines dismissed. What would you do? Daniel asked. Robert leaned back and thought about it. I'd give them a chance to make this right. Send them a formal letter disputing the fines, including copies of this easement agreement. Make it clear that their foreclosure threat has triggered the voiding clause. Most reasonable people would back down immediately once they understand the situation. But Mrs. Whitmore isn't reasonable, Daniel said. Then we go to court, and you win. This is as solid a legal position as I've ever seen. The question isn't whether you have the right to shut down their road. You absolutely do. The question is whether you want to be the person who does that. Daniel thought about all his neighbors. Most of them were innocent in all this. They'd never harassed him or supported Mrs. Whitmore's vendetta. They were just people trying to live their lives. Shutting down the road would hurt them as much as it would hurt the HOA board. But he also thought about that smug note Mrs. Whitmore had sent him. Perhaps Willowbrook Estates isn't the right fit for everyone. She'd been so certain of her power, so confident that she could bully him into submission or force him out of his home. Let's send the letter, Daniel said. Let's give them the chance to do the right thing. Robert drafted a formal response to the HOA's demand. The letter was beautifully written, the kind of legal writing that was polite on the surface but devastating in its implications. It disputed each of the $70,000 in fines, providing evidence that they were either based on selectively enforced rules or on violations that other residents committed without penalty. Then came the important part. The letter referenced the easement agreement, attached copies of the relevant documents, and explained that Daniel was the legal owner of Willowbrook Way. It noted that the HOA's threat of foreclosure had triggered the voiding clause in the easement agreement, giving Daniel the legal right to restrict access to the road. The letter concluded with a reasonable offer. Daniel would be willing to continue the existing easement arrangement and even formally deed the road to the HOA, but only after all fines against him were dismissed and he received a formal written apology from the board for the harassment he'd endured. Robert sent the letter via certified mail to the HOA board, with copies to each individual board member at their homes. He also sent a copy to the HOA's legal team. The whole thing was done properly, professionally, and completely by the book. Daniel expected a response within a few days. Instead, he got one within 3 hours. Mrs. Whitmore called him directly, her voice tight with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't possibly think you can blackmail the entire HOA with some dusty old document from 40 years ago." Daniel kept his voice calm. "I'm not blackmailing anyone. I'm simply asserting my legal rights and requesting that $70,000 in bogus fines be dismissed." "That seems fair. Those fines are legitimate. You violated clearly stated rules. Rules that you selectively enforce against me while ignoring identical violations by other residents. I have documentation of all of it." There was a pause. When Mrs. Whitmore spoke again, her voice was cold. "You think you're clever, but you're making a huge mistake. That easement doesn't mean what you think it means. Our attorneys will tear your case apart. This changes nothing. See you in court." She hung up before Daniel could respond. Robert called him an hour later. "I just got off the phone with the HOA's attorney. He's actually furious, but not at you. He reviewed your documents and immediately advised the board to settle. He told them this is unwinnable and that Mrs. Whitmore is exposing the HOA to massive liability. But she doesn't want to settle," Daniel guessed. "Correct. She's overruling her own attorney and insisting they fight this, which is actually good news for you, because it means this will go to court and you'll win, but it also means things might get ugly before they get better." Daniel looked out his window at the peaceful neighborhood street. Kids were riding bikes. Someone was walking their dog. Everything looked so normal from the outside. Nobody knew that a legal war was about to erupt over who owned the ground beneath their feet. "Let her fight," Daniel said quietly. "I'm done being bullied." What Daniel didn't know yet was that he wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. The sassy. Robert suggested that Daniel do something that seemed counterintuitive at first. Instead of keeping the easement discovery quiet while they fought the HOA in court, he should tell everyone in the neighborhood about it. All 126 other families who lived in Willowbrook Estates deserved to know what was happening. "Why would I want to do that?" Daniel asked. "Won't it just turn everyone against me? They'll think I'm threatening their access to their own homes." "Some might see it that way initially," Robert admitted. "But think about it. You're not the one who created this situation. The HOA did when they threatened to foreclose on your house. And I'm willing to bet you're not the only person Mrs. Whitmore has targeted. If we frame this correctly, your neighbors will see you as someone fighting back against an abusive board, not as a threat to their daily lives." That made sense. Daniel had heard whispers at community meetings before, other people complaining about violation notices and fines that seemed excessive or unfair. He'd just never paid much attention because it wasn't happening to him. Now he wondered how many other residents were suffering under Mrs. Whitmore's rule. They drafted a letter to all homeowners explaining the situation in clear, simple terms. Daniel introduced himself, outlined the harassment he'd faced, and explained the $70,000 fine the HOA had imposed. Then he detailed his discovery of the easement agreement and what it meant legally. The letter was careful to emphasize that Daniel had no desire to restrict anyone's access to the road. His only goal was to stop the harassment and get the unjust fines dismissed. He included copies of the easement documents so people could see for themselves that this wasn't a bluff or a legal trick. He also shared his documentation of selective enforcement, showing examples of other residents with identical violations who'd never received fines. The letter ended with an invitation. An emergency community meeting would be held that Saturday at the community center, outside of the HOA's formal meeting structure. Everyone was welcome to attend, ask questions, and voice their concerns about how the board was being run. Robert helped Daniel send certified letters to every address in Willowbrook Estates. It cost him over $500 in postage and printing, but it was worth it. The letters went out on a Tuesday. By Wednesday evening, Daniel's phone was ringing constantly. The first few calls were hostile, exactly what he'd feared. People accused him of bullying the whole neighborhood, of being selfish, of creating problems where none existed. One man shouted that Daniel should just pay his fines like everyone else and stop making trouble. Daniel listened politely, explained his position, and accepted that not everyone would be on his side. But then other calls started coming in. A woman named Helen, who lived 3 streets over, called crying. She'd been fined $15,000 over the past year for having a memorial garden in her front yard for her late husband. The garden had flowers and a small bench with a plaque bearing his name. Mrs. Whitmore claimed it violated architectural guidelines and demanded she remove it. Helen had been making payment plan installments for months, terrified she'd lose her house. A retired veteran called to say he'd been fined for displaying an American flag one day past Memorial Day weekend. The fine was $1,200. He'd paid it because he didn't know what else to do. But it had made him furious. A young couple with 2 small kids explained that they'd been fined repeatedly for toys visible in their yard, for their children's artwork taped to windows, for a birthday party decoration that stayed up one day too long. They were drowning in fees and had been seriously considering selling their house just to escape. Story after story poured in. Daniel started writing them all down. By Saturday morning, he had documentation of over 40 families who'd been hit with what they considered excessive or unfair fines. The total amount exceeded $400,000. Saturday's meeting was packed. The community center only held about 100 people, but at least 150 showed up. People stood in the aisles and crowded around the doorways. Daniel had never seen so many of his neighbors in one place. Mrs. Whitmore showed up too, along with 3 other board members. They sat in the front row with their arms crossed, their expressions hostile. Mrs. Whitmore kept whispering to the others and shaking her head as if she couldn't believe the audacity of this gathering. Daniel stood at the front of the room with Robert beside him. He was nervous but determined. He'd spent years serving his country and running his own business. He could handle speaking in front of his neighbors. He started by thanking everyone for coming. Then he laid out his story simply and honestly. The truck violation, the fence, the shed, the endless string of fines for minor or phantom violations, the $70,000 demand and threat of foreclosure. He showed copies of his documentation, including photos of other people's identical violations that had never been cited. Then he explained the easement agreement. He passed around copies so people could examine them. He made it absolutely clear that he had no intention of blocking anyone's access to the road. His fight was with the HOA board's abuse of power, not with his neighbors. "I'm not your enemy," Daniel said, looking around the room. "I'm just someone who refused to be bullied, and I happen to have leverage that most people don't have. But this isn't about me anymore. This is about how our HOA has been operating, and whether we want to continue living under this kind of rule." Mrs. Whitmore stood up, her face red. "This is completely inappropriate. You're spreading lies about the board and threatening this entire community. Those fines were legitimate enforcement of rules that everyone agreed to follow." "Did everyone agree?" Daniel asked calmly. "Because I've been getting calls all week from people with similar stories. Maybe some of them would like to share." Helen stood up, her voice shaking. "I was fined $15,000 for a memorial garden for my husband. He died 2 years ago, and having that garden helped me grieve. Mrs. Whitmore said it was an unauthorized landscape modification and gave me 30 days to remove it or face foreclosure." A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore's face tightened. "That garden violated clearly stated architectural guidelines. We have standards to maintain. What about my flag?" The veteran called out. "I served this country for 20 years. I displayed the American flag on Memorial Day weekend, and you fined me because I didn't take it down fast enough. The holiday decoration rules apply to all decorations, including flags," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "Rules are rules." More people started speaking up. The young couple talked about being fined for their kids' toys. Someone else mentioned being charged for having the wrong color garden hose. An elderly man said he'd been fined for his medical equipment van that his daughter used to take him to doctor's appointments. The room grew louder, people talking over each other, sharing their own stories of fines and harassment. Mrs. Whitmore kept trying to regain control, shouting that this was all a coordinated attack and that the rules existed for everyone's benefit. Finally, someone in the back of the room stood up. It was Tom Fletcher, a quiet guy who'd lived in Willowbrook for over a decade. Daniel knew him slightly, enough to wave to when they passed each other. "I want to make a motion," Tom called out loudly. "I move that we recall the entire HOA board effective immediately and elect an interim board to conduct a full audit of all fines issued in the past 2 years." The room went silent. Mrs. Whitmore's face went pale. "You can't do that. This isn't an official HOA meeting. You can't make motions here." "Actually, we can," Robert spoke up. According to your own bylaws, any gathering of more than 25% of homeowners constitutes a valid community meeting. You have over 50% of the neighborhood here right now. Any votes taken here are binding. This is absurd. Mrs. Whitmore looked at the other board members. We're not going to recognize this circus. Let's vote, someone else called out. All in favor of recalling the board? The room erupted with raised hands and shouted agreements. Daniel did a quick visual count. At least 3/4 of the people present were in favor. All opposed? Mrs. Whitmore and the 4 board members raised their hands, along with maybe 10 other people scattered through the room. The motion passes, Tom declared. The board is recalled. I nominate myself, Daniel, and Helen to serve as interim board members until we can hold proper elections. Do I have a second? Seconded. Multiple voices called out. The vote for the interim board was just as overwhelming. Within 20 minutes, the power structure of Willowbrook Estates had completely flipped. Mrs. Whitmore gathered her papers and stormed out of the community center, the other former board members trailing behind her. After she left, the room buzzed with conversation. People were energized, angry, hopeful, confused. Robert helped Daniel and the other new interim board members understand their immediate responsibilities. They needed to secure the HOA's financial records, contact the HOA's attorney to inform them of the board change, and begin the process of reviewing all outstanding fines. Over the next few weeks, the true scope of Mrs. Whitmore's operation became clear. The interim board hired an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances. What they found was disturbing. Mrs. Whitmore had issued over $400,000 in fines during HI. The easement agreement was still valid, and technically the HOA's foreclosure threat had triggered the clause that voided the access rights. Daniel could have left things in limbo, keeping ownership of the road as permanent leverage against any future board that might try to abuse their power. Robert even suggested that strategy. It would protect Daniel forever. But Daniel kept thinking about his neighbors, the people who'd stood up at that meeting and shared their own stories, the families who'd supported him when he needed it. They deserved better than to live with uncertainty hanging over their heads, wondering if the only road to their homes might someday be taken away. More than that, Daniel thought about his Uncle Richard. The old man had been clever enough to retain ownership of the road, yes, but he'd lived peacefully in this neighborhood for decades. He could have used that leverage at any time, could have charged fees or flexed his power. Instead, he'd accepted $1 per year and let everyone go about their lives. That wasn't the action of someone who wanted to rule over his neighbors. That was someone who believed in having insurance but hoped he'd never need to use it. Daniel realized that's what the easement had always been. Insurance. A way to make sure that if developers or an HOA ever got too big for their britches, someone would have the power to push back. His uncle had used that power by simply having it, and everyone had behaved reasonably as a result. But the neighborhood had changed. The development company was long gone. The HOA had proven it could be corrupted by the wrong leadership. If Daniel just handed over the road with no strings attached, what would stop another Mrs. Whitmore from rising to power 5 or 10 years from now? He called a meeting with the interim board and Robert to discuss options. They met at Helen's house, sitting around her kitchen table with coffee and notebooks. Here's what I'm thinking, Daniel said. I'll deed the road to the HOA permanently, just like the original agreement intended. But only after we make some changes to how the HOA operates. Changes that will protect everyone from this kind of abuse happening again. What kind of changes? Tom asked. Daniel had been thinking about this for days. First, strict limits on fines. A cap on how much the HOA can charge for any single violation, and a total annual cap per household. Something reasonable that covers actual costs without being used as a weapon. Helen nodded. That makes sense. What else? Mandatory arbitration for any dispute over fines. If a homeowner thinks a fine is unfair, they get access to an independent mediator and both sides have to accept that decision. No more board members acting as judge and jury for their own citations. Financial transparency, Tom added. Every dollar in and out should be documented and available for homeowners to review. No more mystery consulting fees or contracts to board members' relatives. And term limits, Daniel continued. Nobody serves as board president for more than 2 consecutive years. Board members rotate off after 4 years maximum. That prevents anyone from building a personal fiefdom. They worked through the details for hours, drafting a new set of bylaws that balanced the HOA's need to maintain the community with protections against abuse. The proposed changes would require a vote of the full membership, but Daniel made it clear that he wouldn't deed over the road until these protections were in place. Some people thought he was being too demanding. A few homeowners argued that the HOA should just take the road through legal action rather than accepting Daniel's conditions. But Robert was clear about how that would go. Daniel would win in court, the HOA would waste tens of thousands in legal fees, and the neighborhood would be torn apart in the process. The smart move was to accept Daniel's offer and implement changes that would benefit everyone. The vote was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, 6 months after that first community meeting where Mrs. Whitmore had been recalled. The turnout was massive. People came with their spouses, brought copies of the proposed bylaws they'd been studying, and settled in for a long discussion. Daniel presented the proposal himself. He walked through each change, explaining why it mattered and how it would work in practice. He answered questions for over an hour. Some people worried the changes would make it too hard to enforce legitimate rules. Others wanted even stricter limits on the board's power. In the end, they put it to a vote. The new bylaws needed approval from 2/3 of homeowners to pass. Daniel stood at the side of the room, his heart pounding as Tom counted raised hands. The measure passed with 82% approval. A cheer went up in the room. Helen was crying happy tears. Tom shook Daniel's hand so hard it hurt. Even some of the people who'd been skeptical of Daniel at the start came up to thank him for forcing changes they'd wanted for years, but never thought possible. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't there. She'd moved out of Willowbrook 3 months earlier, quietly listing her house and leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. Rumors said she was facing some kind of investigation related to the HOA finances, but nothing had been confirmed. Daniel didn't spend much time thinking about her. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The following week, Daniel sat in Robert's office and signed the deed transfer documents. Willowbrook Way officially became property of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, held in trust for the benefit of all residents. The transfer cost $1, just like his uncle's original agreement. Daniel liked the symmetry of that. As he signed the papers, Robert smiled. "Your uncle would be proud, you know. He set up a system that protected him and everyone else. You used it exactly as intended and then made it even better." "I just wanted to keep my house," Daniel said, but he was smiling too. "You did more than that. You fixed a broken system." Life in Willowbrook Estates settled into a new normal over the following months. The permanent board elections were held, and a diverse group of level-headed people stepped up to serve. The new board operated with the transparency and fairness that the old one had lacked. Fines were issued only for legitimate violations, and disputes were resolved through calm discussion rather than threats. Daniel's fence stayed exactly as it was, 6 feet tall and perfectly functional. His shed remained in his backyard. His work truck sat in his driveway every night, and nobody said a word about it. More importantly, Helen's memorial garden stayed intact. The veterans' flag flew on holidays, and the young couple's kids played in their yard without fear that their toys would trigger fines. The neighborhood developed a reputation as one of the best-run HOAs in the county. People actually wanted to serve on the board now, because it was about helping the community rather than wielding power. Property values went up, not because of strict enforcement of petty rules, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a place where they were treated with respect. Daniel became something of a local legend, though he didn't like the attention much. People sometimes mentioned him in articles about HOA reform. He did a few interviews sharing his story, always emphasizing that he'd just been a regular person who refused to be bullied and happened to have leverage. But the real impact was quieter and more personal. Other people in other neighborhoods heard his story and started checking their own property records, looking into their HOA's finances, asking questions about whether fines were being applied fairly. A few even discovered similar situations where old property rights could be used to push back against abusive boards. Daniel kept his uncle's original documents in a safe deposit box, no longer in dusty boxes in the attic. He'd pass them on to whoever inherited his house someday, along with a letter explaining what had happened and why it mattered. The easement was gone now, transferred to the HOA as intended, but the lesson remained. Power needs to be balanced. Rules need to be fair. And sometimes standing up to bullies requires leverage. But knowing when to use that leverage and when to build something better makes all the difference. On warm evenings, Daniel liked to sit on his front porch and watch his neighbors go about their lives. Kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, couples chatting over fences. All of it taking place on a road that had been at the center of such conflict, but was now just a peaceful street in a well-run community. His work truck sat in the driveway, exactly where it belonged. His fence stood at its original height. His shed stored his lawn equipment. Simple things that should never have been controversial, and every time he looked at them, he was reminded that sometimes the most important battles aren't about big dramatic gestures. They're about defending the right to live peacefully in your own home without harassment. A young family moved into the house where Mrs. Whitmore used to live. They had 3 little kids who loved to play in the front yard, their toys scattered across the lawn, visible from the street, colorful and chaotic and completely fine. Nobody sent them violation notices. Nobody measured their grass height with a ruler. Nobody watched their house looking for reasons to fine them. That, Daniel thought, was the real victory. Not that he'd won a legal battle or outsmarted an abusive HOA president, but that families could now live here without fear. That rules existed to help the community, rather than to control and punish it. That the place his uncle had called home for decades could continue being a real neighborhood instead of a battlefield. He'd told Robert once that he just wanted to keep his house. In